better that way.
Well, let's go ahead and begin. I'm delighted.
An introduction.
What's that?
I need to introduce you.
Oh, okay.
I'm Chad Ellison. He's one of our philosophy of religion students, and one of the last of that cohort because we had to phase out that degree when we started the apologetics and ethics degree. But very bright young man, and I often go out with him and other folks and talk about the sorts of things we'll be talking about today. So I'm sure it'll be done very well, and you'll learn a lot.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome. I am delighted to be here this evening, and thank you for coming and tacitly committing to enduring me for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. So, why don't we start with prayer? So if you would join me in bowing your heads. Almighty God, we commit this time to you and ask that you would make it useful. We ask that you would captivate our minds and our hearts by the awesomeness of your power. We pray that you would use this time for us to understand who you are and to know you better. That those who don't know you would come to know you, and that your kingdom would be advanced through this time. In Christ's name, amen. There's a documentary that came out several years ago called Expelled. Is anyone familiar with that documentary in here? Okay, a few of you. Well, in this documentary, Ben Stein interviews an atheist biologist named Richard Dawkins. And so he's asking him about the question that we are looking at tonight: where did everything come from? And so he responds by saying, well, it came from a single cell that self-replicated itself. And he says, well, where did that come from? And basically Ben Stein just keeps pressing him. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? Until eventually Richard Dawkins just appeals to extraterrestrial life. He says, well, maybe some other life evolved in the universe to a very sophisticated level and eventually seeded life on Earth, or planted the building blocks for life on Earth. Well, if you have ever asked yourself where life came from or where anything came from, and thought about it as deeply as Richard Dawkins or Ben Stein, then you have engaged to some degree with the content of a cosmological argument. Cosmological arguments really date as far back as the ancient Greeks. And Aristotle actually appealed to an unmoved mover to account for the change in the universe or in the world. And so tonight we're going to be looking at two different cosmological arguments: the Kalam cosmological argument and the Leibnizian cosmological argument. So let's start off by imagining that you are walking down the street with a friend. And as you guys are walking down the street, all of a sudden, this blinding, flashing red light appears. And you turn to your traveling companion and you say, what caused this? And he looks at you and he just says, nothing. Nothing caused this. It just happened, uncaused, out of nothing. Well, you wouldn't accept this as an answer. You would know that there has to be some cause or explanation for this flashing red light. And so the first argument I want to look at is the Kalam cosmological argument. And just like this flashing red light needs a cause or an explanation for its existence, so the universe needs a cause or an explanation for its existence. So you should have the on your outline there, the Kalam cosmological argument. And this argument really, two of the major things that it addresses are the nature of causality, or the way that things come into being, and whether or not the universe is eternal. So let's go ahead and read it. And real quick, by universe here, we mean all of space, all of matter, and all of time. Okay, so premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. And 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. So this is a deductive argument. And what that means is that if these premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Okay? So another way to look at this is the only way to escape the conclusion of this argument is to show that at least one of the premises is false, or at least more likely false than true. So if we're able to show that at least these premises are at least more likely true than they are false, then we ought to accept the conclusion of this argument. So, are there any questions so far, by the way? Okay, and I just want to say, at any point in this, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Questions are definitely very good. And I know especially, for me, the first time I was engaging in a lot of this, I really had to stop because a lot of it was just way over my head. So if there is any of this that you want me to stop or clarify, please don't hesitate to ask. I'll try to stop at the end of each major point and ask questions, but just feel free to raise your hand in case I get overly ambitious to run through the outline. Okay, so let's look at this first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is rooted in a metaphysical principle that says that out of nothing, nothing comes. This is just another way of saying that things don't just come into being out of nothing. William Lane Craig says, he points this out, for something to come into existence without a cause of any sort is to come into being from nothing. The principle that a thing needs a cause in order to come into being is intuitively obvious. So recall this example of the red flash. There was the red flashing light. We don't even entertain seriously the idea that this just happened without a cause. The idea is just absurd to think that it could have just come into being without a cause. Similarly, we attribute causes to things like buildings or iPhones or mountains. Buildings came into existence because somebody built them. iPhones exist because somebody thought them up and assembled them. And mountains exist because of geological processes. So similarly, if there's a phenomena, we should expect for it to have a cause, if indeed it came into being. Okay, so let's look at now objections to this first premise. Typically, this is pretty undisputed. A lot of people will not object to this premise. But there are a few objections that have been raised, and one of them goes like this. It should be there on your outline. This metaphysical principle, out of nothing, nothing comes, only applies to things in the universe, but it doesn't apply to the universe as a whole. Okay? Now the problem with this objection, is that it makes an arbitrary distinction of when to apply this. In other words, this is not just a physical principle about reality, this is a metaphysical principle. We apply this to all of reality. And so to simply just look at reality, to scrutinize reality, and use this principle, but then all of a sudden dismiss it when we get to the universe as a whole, this is just an arbitrary distinction. This is called the taxi cab fallacy. And the idea with that is that you use a principle or you use this to your desired destination, and then you dismiss it when it's convenient for you. And in your reading, if you did the book, if you did your reading, Craig uses the example of a translucent ball. So he talks about if you're just walking in the woods and you come across this translucent ball. Well, you know that there's got to be some reason or explanation for this ball being here. Just because you increase the size of the ball wouldn't change the fact that it needs an explanation. So if you made the ball, if the ball was the size of a car, it would still need an explanation. If the ball was the size of a baseball field, it would still need an explanation. And if the ball was the size of the whole universe, it would still need an explanation. Okay, so let's look at this next objection, which I'll go ahead and call the Lawrence Krauss objection, because he's one of just the very few people that make this claim. But he says that the universe actually did come from nothing, and that things come from nothing all the time. Now the problem with Lawrence Krauss's objection here is really what's going on with his use of the word nothing. He really does what's called equivocation. So he takes this word nothing, and he uses it in a very different sense. When philosophers are talking about nothing, we're referring to a word's been referred to that really signifies the absence of anything and everything. But when Lawrence Krauss uses this word, he's talking about this quantum vacuum. So Craig here quotes him. He says, when Krauss says the universe came from nothing, no, I'm sorry, here we go. For Krauss, nothing refers to subatomic vacuum of fluctuating particles. As Craig notes, particles arise as spontaneous fluctuations of the energy contained in the subatomic vacuum. The quantum vacuum is not nothing, but it is a sea of fluctuating energy endowed with a rich structure and subject to physical laws. So when Krauss is talking about nothing here, this is not really nothing in the sense of the absence of anything and everything. Because nothing doesn't have properties. Nothing doesn't include energy. So this is simply just an equivocation of the term nothing. So consequently, the idea that a thing can just come into being from nothing or begin to exist without a cause, it's never been observed. It contradicts first principle of metaphysics and actually requires more faith to believe than it does to believe that the universe had a cause or that it just had a cause. I was talking a few years back with a lady, and she raises this point that Lawrence Krauss is talking about and just says, well, Lawrence Krauss says the universe just came from nothing. And at this point, you should really just ask, well, if you're willing to believe that, if you're willing to believe the universe just came from nothing, why not give God a chance? Why not just believe in God? And I said that to her, and she said, on some days she does. So I guess that's helpful. All right. So are there any questions so far regarding premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument?
Chad, there's one thing.
Yes.
When notable physicists start to talk about philosophy, they're almost always wrong. It's the expertise is not transferable principle. So if you're an expert on quantum mechanics or an expert on black holes like Stephen Hawking, it doesn't mean you can think philosophically. And Krauss and Hawking are terrible on philosophy. So you shouldn't be blinded by science or blinded by the scientists, because they have to give good arguments when they start to do philosophy and metaphysics about God. Someone can be good on physics but not be good on metaphysics. There's first principles of reasoning and being. And we should be encouraged by that, because we don't have to be intimidated just because someone has a PhD from a swanky school.
Right, that's such a good point. And so often people will just have this platform or this position and this wide audience because they'll be very bright or very accomplished in one field. But as Dr. Rotai said, that doesn't mean that they are competent in all fields then. So, yes?
I'm assuming that's transferable to people that are scholars, and philosophy might not be all that intelligent about the scientific side of things.
Yes, that is true. I think that's a really good point. And I think that's why, even with William Lane Craig, what he does when he's making his arguments and he's appealing to science, he quotes physicists and he quotes astrophysicists and he quotes scientists to show that, hey, don't just take this on my word or on Craig's word because he's Bill Craig, but take it from a professional in that field. So that's a very good point. I mean, that sword cuts both ways. So for us too, or for anybody, just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean that you have that same authority in other fields. All right, so let's look at the second premise here. The universe began to exist. Typically, atheists have just said the universe is eternal and therefore never began to exist. Now notice if the universe never began to exist, then it wouldn't need a cause for its existence, because it never would have begun to exist. It would have just always been there, or here. But there are both scientific and philosophical reasons to think that the universe is not eternal and in fact did come into being sometime in the finite past. And the first scientific reason for this is the second law of thermodynamics. So astrophysicist P.C.W. Davies makes this point. He says, the stock of energy available in the universe to drive them is finite and cannot last for eternity. This is an example of the so-called second law of thermodynamics, which, applied to the entire cosmos, predicts that it is stuck on a one-way slide of degeneration and decay towards a final state of maximum entropy or disorder. As this final state has not yet been reached, it follows that the universe cannot have existed for an infinite time. So the idea here is that you have all the stars and the usable energy burning away in the universe right now. Well, given an infinite past, given an infinite number of past events, all of these things would have run out by now. The universe would no longer have any usable energy left. All the stars would be burned out. The universe would be in this just dead state of equilibrium. So that is one reason why the universe cannot be eternal.
Wouldn't the other side of that, though, be that we are not there yet?
Well,
we have not reached infinity yet.
Well, if we haven't reached infinity yet, then there can't have been a past infinity.
Right.
Infinity can't have been completed sometime in the past.
So if it is infinite, then, and we haven't reached it yet, I'm kind of trying to figure out the other side of the argument here is, then since we have not reached that infinity stage yet, matter and energy is still here. And it always will be here because infinity never stops.
Well, infinity would never end.
Right.
But usable energy that is running out eventually has to be exhausted. So let's see.
I got it. I understand.
Okay, you sure?
Yeah, I got it figured out.
Okay.
Can you flesh out like just the word infinity a little bit more?
Yeah.
'Cause
Yes.
That's kind of snarling me a little bit.
Okay, well, let me try to explain this kind of in the context of your question just now. Infinity, there's a difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. A potential infinite would be something like this. Like, here is a thing, x, and it is traveling in this direction, and it will continue to travel in this direction forever. But it hasn't already completed it. It's on its way, and it'll never stop. Okay? So no matter how far x travels in this direction here,
It'll never be there.
it'll never actually reach an actual infinite, because no matter at what point you go, whenever you look back and you count, the number of events or the amount of time that has passed, you still have a finite number. That is a something that's not infinite. It's just a finite. So this is a potential infinite. Here. Spelled that wrong. Okay. An actual infinite would be the whole set that's already completed. So maybe a good example of this would be the whole entire set of natural numbers. This would be an actual infinite. So numbers all the way from 1 to infinity, as including literally the entire set, just all existing, that would be an example of an actual infinite. Does that help clarify it?
And that includes like going back into negative numbers also, like it includes everything.
Well, it could. So,
Because then you'd be going back into infinity the other way, I guess.
right, it could. So it doesn't necessarily have to. You could have, for instance, the numbers 1 to infinity. And you have this whole completed set, 1 to positive infinity. And that would be an actual infinite, that entire completed set. You could also have the other set of negative infinity to 1. And that would be, this entire set would be an actual infinite. And then furthermore, you could also have negative infinity, hopefully you guys can still see this, to infinity. And that would also be an infinite set. So a good way to think about infinity is just without end. And then we'll talk more about infinity too with some of the other material that will come up in this discussion. So let's look at the second scientific reason why we can't have an actually infinitely old universe. This one is because the universe is in a state of expansion. So, and we have another P.C.W. Davies quote on this. So he says, "We reach a point when all distances in the universe have shrunk to 0. An initial cosmological singularity, therefore, forms a past temporal extremity to the universe. The Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all matter and energy in the universe, but also of space-time itself." So what Davies means here when he says, in this first sentence, we reach a point when all distances in the universe have shrunk to 0. What he's saying is, so let's just say this circle represents our universe, and we observe that presently our universe is expanding. So we see that our universe is expanding. Well, if you reverse this and you start going backwards, what happens is the universe actually gets smaller, because as you go back in time, it was less expanded. And so he's saying that you eventually reach a point where all these distances of all the stars are condensed and compact to 0. There is no distance between anything. And so in this sense, a singularity or a beginning point is unavoidable. So that is Davies' point on that. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you're talking to somebody and you present these two scientific reasons, and let's suppose they say, you know what, they still assert, you know, the universe is just eternal, irregardless of the scientific evidence that you show. Well, they would also have to deal with the philosophical problem of an actually infinitely old universe. You see, philosophically, if there were an actual infinite number of past events, or if the universe has existed forever, then it would be impossible for us ever to arrive at the present moment that we're in right now. This is because an infinite number of moments would have had to first transpire before we would get to this moment. But if it were an actual infinite, then that would never get done transpiring. We would never actually reach this moment. A good way to think of this, and Craig uses this example as well, is imagine a chain of standing dominoes. So suppose we have all these dominoes here, and let's suppose this domino X, represents the present moment. Well, before domino X can fall, the domino before it must fall. And before this domino, the domino before it. So on and so forth for infinity. And remember, actual infinity would be this entire set of infinite dominoes. Well, the problem here is that no matter how far back you go on this chain of dominoes, no matter how far back you go, you still have an infinite number of dominoes that remain. And the number that you've gone back will always be just finite. So again, this is kind of like trying to count up to infinity. You could start counting up to infinity. You could start now and start counting up to infinity. Well, you would never actually get there. You would never reach a point where you said, infinity, I made it. You know, or likewise, you could start at infinity and count down to 0, which would be this present moment. And this, for the same reason, you can't start at the other end. So the infinite doesn't become traversable by switching ends that you start at. And really, the principle here is that you can never arrive at an actual infinite by successive addition. And that is, you can't ever take a finite number and continually add more finite numbers and ever arrive at an actual infinite. You can continually add finite numbers forever, and that would be potential infinite. But it wouldn't be an actual infinite until you have literally the entire infinite set, which you can never get at by adding finite numbers to a finite number. So, since the present moment is here, it follows that the universe is not eternal in the past. That it actually came into being at some point in the finite past. Are there any questions about that? Yes, Ben.
Could you maybe just or say briefly what an infinite is in terms of its metaphysical status? If we're saying there can't be an actual infinite, so there's no, grounding for its existence. Is just this an idea we have? Is it an abstract object? So we can think of a set of the infinite, numbers in this set, but it doesn't have, you can't go out and just point to this and say, well, that's what it is. So what is this infinite that we're thinking about and talking about right now?
Right. The mathematician David Hilbert, which is referred to in the book, I believe, talks about how infinity is really just a concept in your mind, that it doesn't actually exist in reality. In other words, there's no instantiations in reality where you could say, oh look, here's infinity. In other words, you can think of the concept of infinity, but you can never, as Ben said, go to a thing. You can never see a bookcase with an infinite number of books on it, or you can never have an infinite number of coins. And so from that, you could actually even develop a separate argument. So here, I just argued that you can't ever arrive at infinity by successive addition. But you can also just say, well, actual infinites don't exist in reality, and therefore the universe can't be an actual infinite, or the universe can't include an actual infinite number of past events.
But then you could also say that God cannot be infinite either, because that does not exist.
Well, that is one case, and I think that it depends on how we define infinite, or it depends on how we define God's being infinite.
But you understand my point.
I do.
Yeah.
I think, it depends on, for instance, let's suppose you want to say that abstract objects exist as these are real things that exist in God's mind as thoughts, and God knows an infinite number of things, and therefore there's an actual infinite. And so that's part of the reason why I used the argument that I did. You can't arrive at an actual infinite by successive addition. I'm still personally wrestling through whether or not actual infinites exist in the sense of, for instance, abstract objects in God's mind or something.
Chad, can you explain abstract objects?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Abstract objects are the best thing is to appeal to an example like numbers. So things like numbers are abstract objects. It's when we take something in reality and we abstract it and appeal to it in the sense of it's not, let's just go with numbers for a sec. So think of abstract objects would be things like numbers, or things like a triangle, or things like a circle, or the idea of a cat. See, these would all be things that we can't actually go in reality and say, and here is a circle, because we don't see or experience anything here of an actual circle. The circle is really just an idea. There's no such thing as that we know of here that's just a one-dimensional object called a circle. But a Platonist says, well, no, these things do exist. These things exist in a higher realm or in a different realm. And they would even say that these things have to exist in order for us to have the ideas of them that we do.
Or maybe we'll talk about propositions, that might help.
Propositions as abstract
Abstract objects. Maybe
Okay.
not.
So, well, a thing like a proposition would be an abstract object as well. So if I said, Chad went to the store, that right there isn't an actual. That would be the content of that, I guess I would say, would be an abstract object. Is that?
Yeah, it's not identical to the sentence. Because you can say Chad went to the store, or you could put it some other way.
Okay, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
In other words, let's go again to numbers. Numbers are not identical to like the symbol of numbers. So if I draw the number 7 here, well, this is not identical to the abstract object 7. This is just a symbol that represents this concept of 7. And so similarly, propositions would function the same way.
Or you could put 7 in Roman numerals, and it has the same content or the same abstract meaning.
Right.
Or you could just say 7,
Mm-hmm.
or you can inscribe 7. So what is it that makes them all 7? It's not any inscription, and it's not any acoustic blast. It's something above those things. It's a concept.
Right.
And Chad used the word instantiate, which means just there's an instance of 7. Right? But 7 is not the same as the instance of 7. This is why we get PhDs.
And so you can do the same thing with propositions. You could say the same thing in 5 different languages.
Same meaning.
Okay.
Could you just define again what a proposition is? Or I don't know if you defined it or not really.
Well, why don't I defer? I'm going to defer. I'm going to use my phone call. And defer to Dr. Vertex.
I'm not home. I'm an abstract object.
Yeah, but
Well,
the lights are on.
Yeah. A proposition is what a sentence affirms, a declarative sentence. So Chad goes to the store. That's a sentence, but the proposition is not identical to the sentence, because you could say that in English, you could say it in Swahili, and it has the same meaning or the same content. So when you think of translating, let's say, from French to English, well, how could that be possible unless there were propositions? Because French is very different than English. You have to be able to translate on the basis of the meaning of the French and then the meaning of the English. So a proposition is not identical to a sentence or identical to someone saying something verbally. It's in a sense the meaning that's behind it.
Okay.
Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So I think we went off in this direction because we were talking about the nature of what we mean when we say God is infinite. And the way that some people understand this is in terms of maximal greatness. So Dr. Groteis uses the example of the perfect batting average. So you can only, what is it, how many can you have, Dr. Groteis?
1,000.
1,000.
Bat 1,000.
Okay, so you could bat 1,000. Now that's the best you can possibly get. You can't do more than that. And so when people refer to God's being infinite, some people mean it in this sense, to where in all of the maximal ways that God could be, or all the ways that God could be, he is those things maximally. And people that would hold this view are people that would say that actual infinites are impossible. And therefore, it would be a contradiction to say that God has these in that way. So if they can't actually be instantiated in reality, then they wouldn't be in the reality of God. Does that make sense? But I'm not taking a position right now on that. And so that's why I just argued from successive addition. Either way, whether or not we think that actual infinites can exist or not exist, it still remains that you can't actually arrive at an actual infinite by simply adding finite numbers to a finite number. Okay, did anyone else have any questions? I thought I might have saw you raise your hand, Robert. Okay. Well, I will move on. Okay. So let's look at what's entailed by the conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So suppose you're talking to your atheist friend, and they grant the premises. They grant the conclusion. They say, "All right, fine. The universe had a cause. So what? What does that mean?" Well, if the universe has a cause, then we're left with a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, extremely powerful, and extremely intelligent, personal being. This is suspiciously and traditionally what people mean by God. And so now you might ask, okay, well, how do you get all those things out of the universe having a cause? So how do you get all those things? All right, well, let's look at the first one. Timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Does anyone want to take a stab at why the cause of the universe would necessarily have to be outside of time, outside of space, and immaterial?
Bible says so. Sorry. Peanut gallery.
Yes, Robert.
If the universe is defined as all of time, matter, and how you can have the concept of space without the concept of matter to recognize the variance in the material, I don't know. But so I don't know how space would exist as an independent concept. Just saying that, to say that because time is part of the universe and material is part of the universe, and I'll say space then would be derivative of material, God would have to be, or the cause of those things would have to be separate from those things.
That's right. Exactly. All right. If these things did not exist without the universe, then whatever caused the universe couldn't have any of those things, because then those things would exist without the universe. And yeah, I think that's an interesting point about space and matter. Maybe we can include space, the concept of space, with the actual infinites. I'm not sure. Okay, so the cause necessarily has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Now what about extremely intelligent and extremely powerful? This one seems kind of obvious. Given the complexity of the universe, given the majesty of the universe, it seems only a being that had incredible knowledge and incredible power could cause these things to exist. The next one, oh yes.
I'm sorry. So regarding extremely intelligent, could a sufficient quantity of power override the need for intelligence? So we see,
I think so, actually.
okay,
I think so. In the sense of, maybe this is where you're going. It seems that all power would entail all knowledge as well. Is that where you're going?
No,
Okay.
actually. So from within, it looks like the universe has a particular set of rules and processes that are necessary for it to function the way it does. However, Craig also makes the argument that the various rules could be different than they are.
Mhm.
So the rules are not necessary.
Mhm.
My question is the function that the rules perform necessary? So another way of putting it would be, is God so smart that he instantiated something that would work this way? Or is God so powerful that created something, and because it was created through that power, it does work this way?
Mhm. So, given God's power, it necessarily works in an incredibly intelligible way? Is that what you're saying?
More just given God's power, it necessarily works because he created. So 1 + 1 = well, that's a bad example.
Is God's power overriding almost than his intellect?
Well,
it's almost
not
a question
is
of-
it, but could
Could
it?
it? Yeah, it's almost a question of which came first, almost.
Well, it's more of what is actually logically derivative from the conclusion that's there. Now, the intelligibility of the universe, I agree, could point back to intelligence behind the universe, but that would be a separate argument from the cosmological argument. I'm more asking about the...
Are you saying that is God such a powerful being that, like, if I was able to make a machine that made coffee and I just poofed, I don't know how it works inside of it, I
But
just
it
had
does
the power
make
to
coffee.
make coffee.
Exactly.
It's like a
Could-
fax machine. I
Could
know
God
how to
not
put it
have the
in.
intelligence to understand how the universe works? He just has the power to create.
Yeah, that's the question.
Well,
okay.
Sort
even that's a different question.
Okay.
Sort of, but, so the cosmological constant, as I understand, is what controls the rate of expansion of the universe. Okay? It has some level of interaction with that. If the cosmological constant were different from our perspective, then that rate would be different. However, if God made the universe with a different cosmological constant, but the same expansion rate, then from our perspective, it would still look like that different cosmological constant was required for the expansion of the universe to be what it was.
Mhm.
But in actuality, the cosmological constant and the expansion would be accidental rather than necessary, and would simply be the result of God saying, the cosmological constant will be X, the expansion will be Y, and then within that, it looks like that's an intelligently expressed thing, because from our perspective, it looks like those two are necessarily linked. And
When in fact they're not necessarily linked.
or they're not designed to be linked.
Mhm.
That there was not an there was not an intellectual, I will do this because it will have this result. There was a, I will do this, it does have this result.
Sure. You know, I'll have to think about that. It's kind of I mean, you can imagine maybe like an infant or something that does something and it creates some sort of effect, but the infant doesn't know. And you're saying, could this also be a possible explanation for the cause of the universe from this?
Yeah.
Why don't we talk more about that afterwards or something like that? Because I would like to think about that some more. Okay, so next, let's move to the uncaused aspect. So, the cause of the universe must also be itself uncaused. Does anyone want to take a stab at why this would be? Okay. Let's look at it this way. So what if the cause of the universe did need a cause? Okay, well then it would need to find its cause in something else. But then, wouldn't that something else too
Have a cause.
now needs a cause for itself?
Got it.
And now wouldn't that cause too need a cause? So what happens is you would get locked into an infinite regress of causes. So it's similar to the domino analogy. Peter Kreeft uses the example of books, or of a book. Suppose you want to borrow a book from your friend. But your friend has to borrow the book from his friend. And his friend has to borrow the book from his other friend. So on and so forth, forever, for infinity. Well, you would never actually get the book. The only way that the only way that you could get the book is if somebody actually had the book. So you need a stopping point. And so similarly, when it comes to the cause of the universe, the only way that you can have that is if you have a stopping point that is a cause that it was itself uncaused. Now, if you wanted to get pedantic and you wanted to say, well, what if the universe had a cause and then that thing had a cause and something else that was uncaused? Well, then we could just go back to that thing and say, well, okay, well, that's the uncaused cause. And it did cause the universe, even if it's not the particular chain link cause. It's higher up the chain that is the uncaused cause. Yes?
Is there anything in being timeless that would imply uncaused? Does a cause require a temporal structure in which to occur?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And we're actually going to get to that next. So that's a
Okay,
great
sorry.
question. Okay. Well, we're not going to get to that just yet, but we will get to it. I thought it was next. All right, so finally, this cause must also be personal. Now this one can get a bit technical. So bear with me, I'll try to go kind of slowly, because sometimes I get confused just talking about it. Hopefully not now. But this cause must be personal. Now what do I mean by personal? Here I mean something with a will or volition. Something that with intentionality, to will to do something. Now the reason for this is because any non-personal cause would have its effect timelessly present with the cause. So, let me say that again. Any non-personal cause would have its effect timelessly present with the cause. So, William Lane Craig uses the example of water freezing. So the cause of water freezing is the temperature being below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is the cause, and the effect is the water freezing. Now, any non-personal cause is always going to have the effect present with it, as long as the cause is present. So as long as the cause is present, this effect with it is going to be present as well. Well, this creates a problem if the cause is timeless. Then that means that the effect would also have to be timeless. So the only way for a temporal effect to come into being from a timeless cause would be if it has personal agency. For instance, a person sitting down can choose to stand up, or a person standing can choose to sit down.
Couldn't time also be that? A point in time?
I'm not sure I understand. Can you explain?
So
what
you
you're asking?
said that couldn't a point in time have a cause and an effect? So, for example, the Big Bang itself is attributed to a time.
Okay.
So, you know, maybe the other, the non-deity argument would be that was the cause, that time, that specific time was the cause that made the Big Bang happen, and the effect was the universe was created.
Okay. I'll try to draw it out, because I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure. So let's suppose.
I'm not either.
What's that?
Join the club.
So we have, let's say that this dot represents the universe coming into being. And then, let's say Big Bang, 14 billion years, and here we are now. But now the cause of this exists outside of time, without time. Whereas once this comes into being, it is now in time. So this represents time. Well, whatever timeless cause existed, if you have a timeless cause, then that effect would also exist timelessly. So in other words, if you have something that's eternal or outside of time or goes back to infinity, well, whatever effects that you have, like the universe, would themselves have to be timelessly present with the cause. So that means that the universe would have to also be eternal. It would be impossible for the universe to just begin to exist a finite time ago when you have a non-personal cause that exists timelessly. There has to be something about this cause that's able to change, to say, I will change and create time. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, like, how do we know that God didn't create the Big Bang Theory? Or, you know, I guess we don't know, but...
You mean that God didn't, the Big Bang wasn't God?
That it was God.
Or that it was God.
I mean, that's a question.
Yeah, well, I think that most, or I dare not say most, a lot of Christians believe that. And that's actually the position that William Lane Craig holds.
Well, wouldn't that be contradictory to the Bible, that
Well,
God personally created everything and it wasn't just an effect of starting from one point?
Well, the counter-argument to that is that is the plan that God had for the universe. That's how he made the universe. That was the beginning.
Yeah.
It depends upon the interpretation of Genesis.
Right, I think with that, the only people that I've encountered that say that creates the Big Bang and the age of the universe being 14 billion years old creates a contradiction with the Bible are the people that say the only way to understand Genesis is to understand it in the context of a literal 7-day creation and a young earth, to where the earth is only 6,000 to 8,000 years old.
9,000 years old.
Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, if that's necessarily what Genesis says, then there would be a contradiction. But I don't think that we have to interpret Genesis that way. And it's not even a modern, this is not even a modern thing, like, oh, we discovered the Big Bang, let's real quickly read into the Bible this sort of, non-literal translation. Even Augustine, this is close to 1,500 years ago, posited that we don't need to understand these day creations as literal days. In fact, Augustine even thought that 7 days was too long, that's too long for God to take to create these things. So there is even a history of people not understanding this literal, or this 7-day account of creation as literal in that sense. And so that would be the position that William Lane Craig holds. A lot of Christians today hold it. A lot of, would you say most of the seminary staff holds it, Dr. Duartes?
I think so.
That's probably what most of the seminary staff here holds. That is definitely a good question, and it's a hot button for some people. Okay. So let's now look at objections to the conclusion of the Kalam. And I'm hoping we can get to the Leibnizian cosmological argument today. If we can't, that's okay. I definitely want to interact with your all's questions and thoughts. All right. So what about when somebody says okay, this doesn't get you to Christianity though. This being, this cause of the universe, doesn't get you to the whole truth of Christianity. Well, we talked about this in our apologetics class, and I think we called it the whole enchilada fallacy, or the whole shebang fallacy. And it's this idea that, okay, if your argument doesn't prove all of Christianity to be true, then it's not valid. Well, that's just not the case. Even if just because your argument doesn't prove all of Christianity to be true, is simply irrelevant. The fact is, the argument is a great argument for the existence of God, and then it's also a great aspect in building a cumulative case for Christianity specifically. Sometimes with this argument, you will hear people then say, okay, well, what caused God, or who caused God? And this is actually what Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion. But I want to open this one up to you guys. How would you guys respond to somebody that said, if you presented this argument to them, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. You showed them what that entails, and then they say, okay, fine, but what caused God? Can you
God didn't begin to exist.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And sadly, a lot of people miss this, and it's right there in the first premise of the argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. And notice this would be true of the universe. If the universe never began to exist, it wouldn't need a cause. So this is not special pleading for God. This would be true of anything that never began to exist. It wouldn't need a cause. Ben?
Another response you could say is, we don't need an explanation of the explanation in order for the first explanation to be valid.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, you could take, say, a carpenter who makes chairs, and you could say, well, the sufficient cause for this chair was this carpenter. And then someone says, well, where did the carpenter come from?
Right.
You say, well, that's irrelevant.
Exactly.
Because the carpenter himself is the sufficient cause to explain the chair's existence. We don't need to know where the carpenter came from or who his parents were or wherever, you know. So.
Or would the other argument be because your parents said, I told you so?
Well, exactly. And that's a great point. And that's just what we were talking about earlier about expertise not being transferable. Because this is one of Richard Dawkins' objections. It's like, well, now you can't use the designer because now you got to explain the designer. Who designed the designer? And that's just simply irrelevant to the whole point. Okay. All right. Okay, given our time, I think I'm going to skip over this. Well, actually, this is the objection that you were talking about, Robert, I think. So maybe I won't. But this is a God and time objection. This is when people say, okay, if we say that we have God existing in a timeless state, this is without the universe, then how can there be things done in sequence in this timeless state? How can there be a sequence of things when time doesn't exist? For example, wouldn't God have to think of the universe before creating it, or conceive of the universe before bringing it into being? And if this is before, doesn't that entail that time exists, but yet we want to say that this cause is timeless, or that God exists outside of time? Well, I think one of the ways to solve this is to parse out a difference between what's called a chronological and logical sequence. So a chronological sequence is one in time. This before this, this after this. But a logical sequence doesn't necessarily need to be a chronological sequence. So with a logical sequence, you could have causes and effects that exist simultaneously. So let me give an example. One example of this would be, we can imagine a person that wills to think and thinks. So the cause would be somebody's will to think. This would be the cause. And the effect would be somebody's thinking. So this would be the effect. Now, it's possible that these things, even though this is the logically prior cause, it's possible that these things happen simultaneously. This one's not chronologically before it, but they happen at the same time. Now, if this is even possible, if we can just show this is even possible, then it's certainly feasible for God. So I think this is one way to get out of this. I think another example is, you could think of the particular math equation, 2 + 2 = 4. Well, in order to get to the effect 4, this comes prior to it. This has to happen prior to this, but it doesn't need to be that way in time. This can exist timelessly. Okay, so that is a real quick God and time objection response. We have about 10 minutes left, so by the way, are there any questions so far about this? Okay, so let's get into the Leibnizian cosmological argument. It's there on your outline. So premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. Therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So this is also a deductive argument, which means that if these first 3 premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, really, the crucial premises in this argument are premises 1 and 2. Premise 3 is pretty obvious. In fact, if someone denies premise 3, we really just have bigger problems than going into a Leibnizian cosmological argument. But let's look at this first premise. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Now, this is just to affirm that reality is rationally intelligible. And it's just saying that there is an explanation for whatever there is that exists. There is an explanation. That's just to say, hey, reality is rationally intelligible. So to deny this premise would really be to deny all grounds we have for doing rational and empirical analysis. So if someone denies this, an argument, a rational argument, is just not going to be very compelling. But if they do deny it, then you should just invite them to believe in God, because they won't be able to have or hold any rational objection to it. Okay, so now let's look at all things have an explanation of their existence. Now what Leibniz does with this is, he says all things, the explanation that all things have for their existence is in one of 2 ways. The explanation, things either exist necessarily or things exist contingently. So who knows what contingent means? Does someone want to say what it means for a thing to be contingent?
It relies upon something else.
Exactly. Yeah, it relies on something else for its existence. And so something that's necessary, a necessary being, would be a thing that its non-existence is impossible. So a necessary being is a thing that it's impossible for it not to exist. Mathematicians have sometimes posited that things like numbers would exist in this way, that the non-existence of the number 7 and the set of natural numbers is impossible. They have to exist. Well, if all things exist in one of these 2 ways, then that means that the universe exists in one of these 2 ways. Now, in order for the universe to be a necessary being, literally every single subatomic particle has to exist necessarily. It can't, its non-existence literally has to be impossible. So to say that the universe is a necessary thing and not a contingent thing is kind of absurd, because in order to say that, you'd really have to say, well, literally, it's not only do all the particles, not only could they not exist, their non-existence is impossible. Okay. Excuse me. Now, given necessary and contingent things, there must be at least one thing that exists necessarily. And this is for the same reason before when we used the book analogy. You can't have everything that exists depend on something else for its existence, because then nothing would ever exist. Because you would have this infinite regress of things depending on something else to exist. So at least something has to exist necessarily. Something has to exist where its non-existence is impossible. So now let's look at premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Now, a way to think of this is just to say, well, the universe either exists necessarily or it exists contingently. And we looked at how it would be absurd to hold that the universe exists necessarily. So therefore, we ought to say the universe exists contingently. But if the universe exists contingently, that is, it depends on something else for its existence, then that something else that it depends on would be God. And this can also, we can look back at what is entailed by the conclusion of the Kalam argument to see that God is the only sufficient cause of the universe. Are there any questions so far?
Well, my husband was, I was talking with him last time, he was saying, well, how do you know God exists? How do you know that would be the contingency? In this case, he would say, how do you know that that contingency would be a creator? Couldn't it just be an accident of the cosmos, an accident of matter, or something in the, I don't really have a word for it, but if someone is refuting the existence of God, the atheist would say, well, what would the contingency be if there were no God?
If there were no God, in other words, what would be?
What would be the explanation? If the universe has an explanation of its existence, it is contingent on something to exist. What would that something be if there were no God? So if the atheist believes there's no God, what would you say to them? How would you, would there be other options for, as contingencies, I guess, is what I'm trying to.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that this was something that Leibniz was really concerned with. Because his starting question was, well, why does something exist rather than nothing? And so what Leibniz wants to show is that God is the only necessary existing being. And Leibniz wants to show that God's non-existence is impossible. And he wants to show that by saying that if you didn't have God as this necessary existing being, then you wouldn't have any necessary existing beings, and there wouldn't be anything that exists. So nothing would exist. And he's saying the fact that we have things that exist contingently, the fact that we have things that depend on other things for their existence, gets us back to a necessary being. And this is similar to Aristotle's idea of the unmoved mover, to where we can't have this, again, infinite regress of contingent things. We said, well, if there's no God, then maybe the universe was caused from some other state of affairs. But then we need to say, well, okay, that needs to be caused by some other state of affairs, which needs to be caused by some other state of affairs, until we get to a necessary existing thing, a thing that exists by the necessity of its own nature, in which its non-existence would be impossible. And so I think the only way out of this is to show somehow, is to try to show that the universe is a thing that exists necessarily. To say that the non-existence of the universe is impossible. But I don't know if anyone would want to take that position. And so, given that, then we looked, okay, well, what would be a sufficient cause for the universe? And I think
I think a better way, another way to answer that question is, okay, then what else, what other explanation would there be?
Mhm.
Let's hear it. Show me something that makes more sense.
Yeah, just to say, well, it could have been this as opposed to that is not an argument.
No, that's
And
the
it's,
point.
what is the most credible way to think of it? That everything came into being out of nothing without a cause, or everything came into being out of nothing caused by a being outside of the universe? And the latter is much more credible, makes a lot of sense. The other is a really bizarre notion of things popping into being out of nothing.
Kind of absurd.
And even the word accident doesn't apply, because an accident is when you have existing things and some arrangement of these existing things is unpredictable. Like I had an accident in my car, it wasn't intended. But if you're talking about everything coming into being out of nothing, the idea of accident doesn't apply, because there aren't things there to interact with each other in strange, unpredictable ways. There's nothing, and then there's everything. That's not even the category of an accident, because accident presupposes things in existence interacting in some ways.
And what are the percentages of us existing? What is it, 0.0004%?
You mean
The odds of us?
the odds? That's next week.
That's next week.
That's fine tuning.
I progressed, sorry.
Thank you, that answers
Yeah,
my
sometimes the skeptics just throw things out there.
Right,
Like,
right.
well, what if it's that? And say, all right, that's maybe possible, but if you're thinking in terms of weighing the evidence, you know, it makes a lot more sense to think of a cause for the universe than just pop goes the universe.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're about out of time. I guess I'll just finish by saying, from these two arguments, what follows is that an extremely powerful and extremely intelligent, necessary, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal being that caused the universe necessarily exists. And I guess a few concluding remarks about this would be that, first of all, one of the things that makes these arguments really powerful is that the premises are very plausibly true. In other words, it's easy to show that the premises are very likely true. Like, go back to the Kalam argument for an example. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. These things seem very easy to demonstrate and show that they're true. But if they're true, then of course the conclusion necessarily follows. And then secondly, another great thing about these arguments, and a lot of apologetics in general, is that you don't need to presuppose the truth of the Bible. You don't need to presuppose the inspiredness of the Bible. You can go to somebody that doesn't believe in the Bible and meet them on common ground and just say, okay, I'm not going to appeal to the Bible. I'm not going to use Christianity as an authority. I'm just going to start on the same ground as you and work our way up to understanding reality solely on the basis of what we observe and on rationality. And so that is it. If you guys have, are there any final questions though? Did I sufficiently confuse anybody? I hope I didn't. Well, thank you for listening.